Good afternoon. This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Tony Dokoupil in New York, where deposed Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro is about to be arraigned in a federal courthouse downtown. It has been an eventful morning for Maduro and a more than eventful 3 days. Just hours ago, as you can see on your screen now, he was taken by helicopter from a Brooklyn detention center where he and his wife were being held in separate solitary cells to Lower Manhattan. From there, he and his wife were loaded into an armored vehicle, a Bearcat, under heavy guard and driven by motorcade into the courthouse. Less than 72 hours before that, the authoritarian leader and his wife Cilia were at home in bed before being captured in a surprise U.S. military operation early Saturday morning. They are now facing narco, terrorism, and drug charges, among others, and will enter a plea any moment now, which is why we are on the air. If convicted, they could face decades in prison. CBS News chief correspondent Matt Gutman is joining us now. He is live outside of the courtroom. Matt, what a day here. You've got dueling protests. I hear the voices behind you, and you've got this extraordinary shift in circumstances for the leader of a very significant South American country. What's the mood like where you are?
And one of the nations with the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Right behind us, and you did hear those chants, there are basically two opposing demonstrations happening here. One on my right is Venezuelans who support his detention and arraignment today, who believe that he should have been taken out of the country and deposed. On the other side, people who oppose U.S. intervention, and what you heard is those two sides kind of clashing. Now, just a second before we came on the air, NYPD moved in, sort of separating the two sides. I think to some degree that also encapsulates what's happening in the country. You might be able to see some of the press behind me, dozens of reporters there, dozens additionally all facing the court ahead of that arraignment, which is set to happen any moment now. We know opposing counsel are in court. Both the public defender for Maduro and his wife are there, and of course the prosecution will be there. We're not yet sure if Maduro has entered the courtroom, but that will happen. And Tony, he's expected to plead not guilty to the four charges against him, which include conspiracy for narco-terrorism, conspiracy to traffic cocaine into the United States, and various weapons charges. These are serious charges. You could face, and they both could face, decades in prison if convicted, but it is going to not be an easy conviction. There's some question about the validity of the evidence that the U.S. has accumulated against him, specifically as the alleged kingpin of a drug cartel. So not going to be necessarily an easy road. There is consensus, however, about the fact that almost every legal analyst that we have spoken to believe that he can get a fair trial here in the United States, Tony.
Hey, Matt, while we have you, I see the barricade behind you, and then behind you, additional barricades. We saw the armored vehicle earlier this morning, the heavy armed guard around Maduro as he was transferred from the helicopter to the courthouse. What are you seeing there and reporting, hearing about in terms of security today?
You can hear some of that security passing by us right now. Obviously, massive amounts of security right outside the courthouse here. And I think you probably saw that video, and people have been watching it all weekend long, of Maduro being flown in on a Department of Justice jet from somewhere in the Caribbean, of Maduro then choppered to Brooklyn or to New York to the DEA headquarters, shuffled in wearing that tracksuit and slides, and then very cordially greeting the DEA officials who might have had a hand in detaining him, saying Happy New Year and good night. And then, of course, this morning being flown from Brooklyn to Manhattan in that helicopter and taken off with all that security around him, then driven here in a Bearcat, one of those armored vehicles. So tremendous security and obviously an enormous amount of interest in this case, Tony.
All right, Matt, thank you very much. Criminal defense attorney Caroline Polisi is with me now. Caroline, thank you very much for being here. We just got word from inside the courtroom. We want to let our viewers know that Maduro and his wife have entered the room. This is courtroom 26A. You know what's going to happen there. What is the process for a day like today?
Yeah, so today is going to be largely procedural. I don't think we will get any bombshell news. The one thing I was looking for today, which we just realized, is that he has retained a private attorney. Previously, he had a court-appointed attorney. It looks like he's retained a pretty well-known a high-profile criminal defense attorney. He actually represented Julian Assange in his New York cases. But
Barry Pollock, right?
Yeah, that's right, Barry Pollock. And so it does seem as though, today will be largely procedural. He will be read the charges against him, those 4 conspiracy counts. He will be asked if he understands those charges, and then he'll enter a plea, likely of not guilty. Given the fact that he now is the retained attorney, I would expect we will see some very robust chest puffing in terms of arguments that they plan to make regarding the illegality of this prosecution.
Let's talk about that for a second, because the protests outside, they're waving signs saying, well, the ones that do not support the Trump administration's actions, there's cheers and celebrations. But on the other side, you have people saying this is an illegal act. That is the #1 criticism. What does the law say about that?
Yeah, it's complicated. There are legal scholars debating this ad infinitum, academically, sort of online, and you can read all of that. Bottom line, international law, yes, this likely did violate international law, but this is not without precedent. I want to make that clear. People are saying this is sort of a move out of the blue. 1989, almost 36 years to the day ago, George H.W. Bush extracted a rogue dictator in Panama, Manuel Noriega, and prosecuted him on American soil. All of the same issues were raised there, and people were crying afoul that this did run afoul of the law. Bill Barr had written a memo, an Office of Legal Counsel memo, previously about 6 months prior to that, stating that under United States law, constitutionally, it's okay for the FBI to use military force to extract a rogue dictator, right? We don't recognize Maduro as the president of Venezuela. We say he is illegitimate, therefore he's not going to get sovereign immunity here. All of those arguments will be made in this case, and I expect the court will follow those precedents to maintain this prosecution.
There's so much in the balance here for the future of Venezuela, for American policy in the region, for Donald Trump politically and personally. But there's also a lot at stake right here in terms of the freedom of Maduro. What does he face if convicted of all of these charges laid out in this indictment, he and his wife?
Yeah, I mean, decades behind bars. If he gets convicted on all 4 counts, you're looking at 30, 40 years to life in prison. Wow. So these are serious charges. Narco trafficking conspiracy carries a hefty sentence. Also, I would note, Tony, there is a forfeiture allegation here, right? Because so the conspiracy was not only for drug trafficking in and of itself, but to enrich, him personally, his family personally, and other top leaders in Venezuela. So there is a large amount of money at stake here that the government is wanting back.
Yeah. They're saying facilitating thousands of tons of cocaine into the country
per year,
running state-sponsored gangs, murders and kidnappings. Very, very serious stuff. Caroline, thank you very much. I want to go now to senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who joins us, I believe, from West Palm Beach. Ed, the politics here are very complicated. They move in a lot of different directions. And I think, oh no, he's at the White House. That's not West Palm Beach at all. A little bit colder. The politics here are moving in a lot of different directions. I understand as we speak, or sometime very soon, members of the Trump administration will be briefing some very upset members of Congress who did not have any kind of heads up about this operation in Venezuela. What do you know about that?
Tony, good to see you. Yes, the president got here back to the White House last night, so he is here today. We're not currently scheduled to see him in public during the course of today, but as you mentioned, senior administration officials, including the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, the CIA Director, are set to brief what's called the Gang of Eight, who are the most senior lawmakers who are supposed to be briefed on a regular basis in classified settings about sensitive national security matters, plus the top Republicans and Democrats on the House and Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations committees. That won't happen until later this afternoon, early this evening, and we'll see, although it's a classified setting, to what extent the justifications are explained yet again, because there is still some confusion, not only here in Washington among policymakers, but around the world, as to what exactly the United States is up to now in Venezuela, and perhaps most recently now conveyed by the UN ambassador, Mike Waltz, speaking before a special meeting of the UN Security Council this morning, reiterating what Secretary Rubio said on Sunday on Face the Nation and in other places, that there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco trafficker who's now going to stand trial in the United States. But that differs from what President Trump was telling reporters last night on his flight back here to Washington. He said repeatedly, "We're in charge," would not provide any specifics about how exactly that's being done, but continued his focus on securing and controlling the flow of Venezuela's oil supply and ensuring that American interests are represented chiefly there in that regard. And of course has also now expressed interest potentially in expanding military operations to other corners of the Western Hemisphere should leaders in those countries not adhere to U.S. values, most notably Colombia, saying it's run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the U.S., raising questions about Cuba, saying it's, quote, ready to fall, and that Cuban Americans will be very happy about it, and raising the prospects of possibly taking action inside Mexico because he blames Mexico's president for not doing more to combat the drug cartels there. So lots of confusion still. We'll see if those senior lawmakers emerge later this evening with answers to their questions, especially about what's next for the U.S. involvement in Venezuela.
Yeah, lawmakers and politicians around the world gathering to talk about this. But you put your finger on, I think, what is most important here, which is the significant political gap between the law enforcement action, that explanation for this move in Venezuela, and then the comments about running the country or dictating the next steps of the country to the installed leadership that's currently there. I know you'll be following that for us, Ed. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I want to bring in senior national security correspondent Charlie Daggett, who can cover the military side of this for us. Charlie, still offshore of Venezuela and in that region in the Caribbean is the largest gathering of soldiers and sailors in more than 50 years, as I understand it. What is their mission there now?
Well, you know, I spoke to those military officials this morning. They really haven't budged even since the raid. So this huge military buildup that you and I have been following for the past few months, spearheaded by the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, the largest and most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. On board, it's bristling with F-18 fighter jets or F-35s in Puerto Rico. Those will remain. The F-35s took part in that raid in Venezuela. The Reaper drones are based in Puerto Rico as well. There are something like 11 warships that remain there and a whole slew of aircraft. And we're learning more about the raid itself. So even though the F-18 fighter jets, F-22s, F-35s were involved in sort of paving the way for these Delta Force agents to get in there, they still took fire. They were flying in at about 100 feet. So as they got closer to the Maduro compound, they faced firefights, and a handful of U.S. service members were injured. President Trump said one of them was pretty badly injured. A helicopter took fire, according to General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but it was flyable, and those pilots were able to get that helicopter back out. Now, in addition to that, maybe dozens of Venezuelans were killed in the raid. But interestingly, Cuba announced that 32 of its citizens, describing them as members of the armed forces and intelligence services, were killed during that raid, which sort of underlines the level of cooperation between Cuba and Venezuela, both overt and covert, that we're not exactly sure where these individuals were stationed because there were a couple of military bases that were hit in addition to the compound, but we can assume that they were also part of Maduro's inner circle and security teams.
All right, Charlie, thank you very much. I just got a note here from our producer in the courthouse. I want to let our viewers know that 12:02 p.m., the judge entered the courtroom and all rose. The judge said, it is my job and my intent to ensure that this is a fair trial and a fair proceeding. So we will keep following what goes on in that courtroom. No cameras allowed in, but we are getting reports from the courthouse, and we'll let you know. Meanwhile, Lilia Luciano is on the Colombia-Venezuela border. They are not letting reporters into the country, as I understand it. Lilia, what are you witnessing there?
That's right, Tony. This is a very dynamic border. Right now, what you're seeing are cars that are coming from Venezuela directly here. I kind of want to set the scene on what's happening in Venezuela. Right now, there is some semblance of stability. There is calm. It seems like there is unity among the people who are in power. But I am getting messages from people in Venezuela who say that the colectivos, the urban gangs who are loyal to the regime, are keeping that order by surveilling, by stopping people in checkpoints on the road, by checking people's social media, by asking people whether or not they supported the strike. So the regime is still very much felt. I want to remind you that Maduro was the head of the regime, but his closest circle of power is still there. The Minister of Defense, who controls the armed forces, is still there. You also have Diosdado Cabello, who has been historically Maduro's henchman, the person who controls those informal gangs or groups, who maintains the fear and who persecutes the people who express their free speech, and the people who, as we saw when we were there as the only network team on the ground covering the election, the people who rose up, the people who protested, the people who supported because they voted for the opposition, and Maduro held on to power, breaking every promise that the regime had made to the U.S. And that, of course, brings us to here. All of those people are still repressed. They are waiting for some kind of negotiation to lead to some kind of democracy. But the person in power, of course, is the vice president. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry to cut you off here. I want to let our viewers know that we just saw that Maduro in court said, "I am an innocent man. I'm not guilty. I'm a decent man." That's a direct quote. I want to go back to CBS News chief correspondent Matt Gutman, who's at the federal courthouse. Matt, this sounds like a dramatic moment here. We've got notes from our producer inside. Maduro taking notes, staring at his paperwork. Then this dramatic moment, he rises and addresses the courthouse. What did he say? What was the reaction?
I mean, it was very interesting and indeed a dramatic moment in court, Tony. Initially, the judge said, "Are you Nicolás Maduro?" To which he answered, "I'm the president of Venezuela. I was captured at my home." And the judge cut him off and said, "I just need to know your name." It continues with Maduro then waiving his right to the judge reading the indictment. The judge read him his rights, and Maduro said, "I didn't know these rights. Your honors inform me of them now." And then, as you said, he said, it didn't appear to actually enter a plea, and we're still trying to verify if that is the case. He said, "I am innocent. I'm not guilty. I'm a decent man. I'm still president of my country." His wife also entered a plea of not guilty, or her attorney did on her behalf. And there's still this conversation happening right now, Tony, about whether he's seen the indictment, whether he knows what's in it, and whether he has been informed of his rights. Again, this is just the initial proceeding in what could be a very long judicial proceeding with Maduro and his wife on these indictments, the first of very many. It does appear that he is entering a plea of not guilty, and this is still going on. The judge is just trying to say, hey, listen, we are here just to ensure that there is a fair trial. There will be more further on. You will have an opportunity to say your piece later on. But right now, we just need to know that you know your rights, that we know who you are, and that you enter a plea. Yeah. So this is ongoing right now, an incredibly dramatic moment in court, Tony.
Dramatic moment in court. You know, people are getting alerts on their phones. You can hear the protesters right by Matt there. And you can see for our viewers, we have a blog going on the right-hand side of your screen that shows what we know when we know it. Not guilty pleas from both Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores. I want to bring in Caroline Polisi, again, our legal correspondent here, analyst, for more on what we just witnessed. Maduro appears to have begun to speak on his own behalf in a broader way about who he was and why he thinks this is unjust, and the judge cuts him off.
Yeah, that's about as dramatic as it gets for an initial appearance and an arraignment, and I'm not surprised that Judge Hellerstein cut him off. He's not allowed to speak in open court. His attorney will speak to him. He answers yes to who he is, and he enters the plea of not guilty. Now, it's interesting that he noted something to the effect of that he didn't understand either the charges against him or his rights.
Rights, yeah.
Because that's what an arraignment is. We need to know, part of the system is that you know what's happening. And I would be surprised if his attorney hadn't gone down. I mean, that's what you do as a defense attorney. You go over in detail what is being alleged. So I would think that they would stop the proceedings to make sure that he understands, because that's a pretty big part of the puzzle here.
Can we talk about the clothes that both Maduro and his wife are wearing here, just to set the scene so people can picture it? He's in orange sneakers. They're both in identical tan kind of jumpsuits. Yeah. Feet are shackled, orange short sleeves underneath, layered underneath. And their hands are unshackled so that when they rise, they can speak freely. Is this a typical wardrobe for this kind of appearance? Why not street clothes? Why not a suit?
Yeah, so oftentimes defense attorneys will fight really hard to get their clients in street clothes or in, a suit and tie, mostly for prejudicial effects in front of a jury. Obviously, there's no jury here today. Likely, his defense attorney hasn't had enough time to sort of, liaise with the prosecution. It's also a Bureau of Prisons issue in terms of the safety and security. They make that call. It's not the prosecutors necessarily. But I would expect that the defense attorneys will make immediate motions to get them in civilian clothing for all future appearances.
All right, Caroline, thank you very much. I want to go back to CBS News Chief Correspondent Matt Gutman, who is back outside the courthouse. Matt, what are you hearing?
You know, Caroline just made a really interesting point about the orange sneakers, the tan suit, and your question of why isn't he in civilian clothes, and how he's dressed right now and how his wife, Cilia Flores, is dressed is also a stark reminder, Tony, of where they are being housed at Metropolitan Detention Center, one of the roughest, most notorious jails in the entire country. That's where Luigi Mangione is. That's where other very high-profile inmates have been, including Ghislaine Maxwell, Sean Diddy Combs, and others. And it is a notorious place because it's kept exceedingly cold. In fact, the main commodity there is socks because people wear 3 pairs of them at a time. The food, I'm told, is abysmal by lawyers who've been there many times. It's moldy. They say it's not fit for human consumption. So it's a far cry from the palaces he's used to in Caracas. And again, these proceedings are still going on. And there is an interesting note to be made here about the extreme care being made by the judge and the prosecution as well as the defense for due process here. They want to make sure that this is done fairly. They want to make sure that the Maduros have been read their rights, that they understand their Miranda rights, that they don't have to say anything. And it's a far cry from virtually no due process that anybody in the opposition would receive in Venezuela. People who are not entitled to due process, who are dumped into black sites run by the intelligence apparatuses there and by the police, and often never heard from again. So some very strong duality that we're seeing right here, right now.
It's remarkable and a really unbelievable shift in circumstances. You mentioned the lifestyle that he was living as the leader of Venezuela. He goes to bed in Venezuela Saturday night as that leader with that lifestyle, wakes up Monday morning in the hands of the DEA and is now in a downtown courthouse. Matt, I understand we have some footage of the protests going on around you. We can hear them. They're getting louder as more news comes out of the courthouse. What are you seeing on these signs? What are people saying?
There are dozens of people, actually probably hundreds of people out here, and I would say many dozens of LAPD trying to enforce the peace. So on one side, you have Venezuela Libertad, Venezuela liberty, freedom. And on the other side, no U.S. war in Venezuela, USA hands off Venezuela, no more bombing of Venezuela. There's something else, down with the fascists. Does not seem that the people who are opposed to Maduro having been snatched out of Caracas in the middle of the night, that many of them are actually from Venezuela or have any connection to it. I don't see Venezuelan flags on that side, and it does seem that everybody on the side that is supporting the judicial process right now, that supports him being arrested, they are all entirely Venezuelan. So an interesting juxtaposition between these two clashing sides. And again, I don't think we have seen anything beyond very mild pushing and some shouting at this point. But obviously the LAPD is keeping a very close eye on it right now.
Matt, you're in New York now. You've joined CBS News here on the East Coast. But I hear you. I understand. I want to bring in senior national. Yeah, a little reminder for you there. I'll be saying good morning to people, not good evening, for a long time. But I want to bring in our senior national security correspondent, Charlie D'Agata, who's got more on the military situation. Charlie, we're all sort of holding our breath here because there's this huge difference between what the Trump administration is saying about the future of Venezuela and the resistance protest language you're hearing from the leadership of Venezuela. And that makes everybody a little bit worried that the military might have another mission here soon. What do you know?
Yeah, well, this is the reason for this forward military posture, the largest posture that has been seen there in decades, because the Trump administration has already warned that they are ready to strike Venezuela again, because we remember that Maduro may have left, but his regime is still very much intact. And there are a number of people within that regime that are still wanted by the United States, as Maduro was. So this maximum pressure is still there. and they will start pushing more pressure on this Venezuelan regime. But in addition to that, we've talked about the oil tankers. A number of oil tankers, according to open source intelligence, have actually left Venezuela, getting through that U.S. blockade. Again, not suggesting that this regime is cooperating with the U.S. authority in that region. As a matter of fact, we've learned that the U.S. military is tracking one of those cargo tankers and may be considering an interdiction. So this is all a very dynamic situation there. And the U.S. military, we call it strike packages. They had those targets in place. And when President Trump says we were ready to launch another wave, you can be sure that that strike package is still intact and those targets are still intact. And you certainly have a multitude of U.S. military assets if that option is taken.
Chilling reminder of the American power there in the region. Charlie, thank you very much. I want to go back to criminal defense attorney Caroline Polisi for more on what happens next, right? So we've got an arraignment. We have 2 not guilty pleas. We have the indictment read. How soon could this go to a jury? We're going to see evidence. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying all Americans should read the indictment.
Yeah.
When are people going to hear about the evidence?
They should read the indictment because it does sort of read like a novel. Very high level, I would note, not a lot of meat. But this is going to take a while. So there are going to, I mean, this is not your average drug trafficking conspiracy. There are obviously the issues that you raised regarding the legality of the raid and the way in which he was brought on American soil. Those will eventually get into separate spheres. The ongoing occupation of Venezuela, essentially, the government is arguing, is sort of a byproduct of this DOJ operation with FBI to extract 2 indicted individuals. They're really focusing on that aspect of it to maintain the constitutionality of it, right? This is not an act of war because lawmakers are already sort of, up in arms over it. But that part will be separated pretty quickly. They will make motions regarding that. But again, the judge will likely follow this precedent that we have saying, regardless of how he was brought to American soil, that's not my job to pontificate on. And he has jurisdiction over him now, and then it will proceed like any other criminal case.
I'm going to ask maybe a dumb question, but I think one that will be on people's minds. Nicolás Maduro is not an unknown figure like a normal defendant might be. He's not an anonymous figure. There are years and years and years of high-quality journalism reporting. Human rights organizations have reported on that detail a regime that has been engaged in torture, starvation, the complete collapse of the economy, general misery, political violence, you name it. All that stuff is public record. That's why you see such a strong reaction from so many Venezuelans saying, we want this guy gone, and yesterday. Is that admissible in any regard into this court conversation? No.
No. One of the beauties of our criminal justice system is that you can't find somebody guilty of a crime based on their character. The rules of evidence famously do not let in other bad acts, we call it. I mean, there are loopholes. If it somehow relates to the offense conduct, maybe some of that could come in. But in general, no, you can't convict somebody just because they're a bad guy. Now, Matt was referencing whether or not he can get a fair trial in the United States. I do believe that he can. It will take a rigorous vetting process from prosecutors and defense attorneys. They'll go through a vigorous voir dire process. I'm sure you've covered them before. The Sean Combs case took days and days because you want to root out people that maybe have pre-existing prejudices or know a lot about the circumstances there such that they couldn't be fair and impartial.
Does that mean potentially there wouldn't be Venezuelans on the jury?
Potentially. I mean, you get a number of strikes just for cause and without cause. It depends. I would imagine that Maduro and his attorneys will have a jury consultant. There's a whole cottage industry out there in terms of what types of jurors they will want to pick. But I do believe that, just as Matt said, too, it makes you proud to be an American. He is being afforded every due process right that an American citizen would on this soil. And the criminal justice system sort of bends over backwards to make sure that that's in place. Both the prosecution and obviously the defense will want this to be a clean trial with no prejudice to it, because they want, if they get a conviction, they want it to be upheld on appeal.
Yeah, and a stark contrast between the way Americans in Venezuelan courts under Maduro have been treated, according to all the reporting on that. Let's bring our senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe back in. Ed, I know you're following the situation with the oil in Venezuela, obviously massive known reserves there. the White House suggesting that American companies are going to go in and get it. What do you know on that front?
Well, let me convey one other bit of information, Tony, we've just learned in the last few minutes. You may be wondering, where is the president in the midst of all of this? Obviously, the wheels of justice are turning up there in New York City. We're told by an aide who's working with him right now that he's in the Oval Office monitoring events, but not necessarily watching television coverage. There isn't obviously anything to be watching from inside that courtroom, but he is aware of what's going on. Again, he's not scheduled to be seen publicly today, at least so far, and will leave much of the explaining to senior officials who are set to meet with senior lawmakers later. Oil, of course, is going to be most likely a big part of that conversation. To what extent is that what the U.S. is most concerned about now? How exactly is the U.S. going to assess the petroleum supply there in Venezuela? Remember, it's believed, or at least at one time, they had the largest known petroleum reserves in the world. The issue, though, is that so much of the infrastructure around it has been allowed to fall into disrepair over the course of the Chavez and Maduro governments. And so there is a desire by American firms and other international petroleum firms to get back into Venezuela and begin developing those fields again. But it will cost tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars over time to make that happen, to employ the correct people, and to then ultimately get the oil out. And so while there may be interest, and there have been reports that some business groups are already making plans to visit in the coming days or weeks, it could be several years until full development and extraction is capable.
Yeah, and then, of course, then if anything would happen, like lower gas prices here in the U.S., but we will be talking to Jill Schlesinger later on the Evening News about that. Ed, thank you very much. In our waning time, I want to go back to CBS News Chief Correspondent Matt Gutman from outside the federal courthouse. Matt, I understand this arraignment has wrapped up. How did it end?
Back up.
Matt, can you hear me? How did this end, this arraignment? The judge has given a date for another appearance?
Yeah, on March 17th, that's the next status date. You can hear the protesters, the demonstrators still going at it against the opposition here. And both at this point, both Flores, who is Nicolás Maduro's wife, and Nicolás Maduro have pleaded not guilty. Interestingly, they have also waived their right to a bail at this point so that they can properly address a bail issue at some point in the near future, hoping that they might be able to get released on bail. Now, something interesting just about the tone of these proceedings, Tony, it has been incredibly cordial and professional. The judge made pains to know that Maduro understood the interpretation. Maduro said it was satisfactory and good enough that I was able to take notes. And then he asked the judge, will I be able to keep my notes? And I don't want, other interference with them. I want them to be kept private. And the judge acceded to that request. Now they're talking about health and medical issues that the Maduros might face, that they might need some additional attention, and the judge is willing to hear that. Interestingly, we are now learning that Flores, Maduro's wife, Cilia Flores, may have fractured or had some severe bruising on her ribs, according to her attorney. And we saw that image earlier of Maduro being walked off the helicopter into that Bearcat armored vehicle, and it looked like he was limping. And there's some question about whether he was perhaps injured in some way during his capture in Venezuela. So those questions are being hammered out. Of course, the nuts and bolts, the most important part to know is that he has pleaded not guilty, as has his wife. The judge has set the next status hearing for March 17th, Tony.
March 17th, 11 a.m. We see on the right-hand side of the screen. We have a live picture up because we understand Maduro might be led out of the courtroom soon. That reference there from Matt about the medical attention is a reminder that we're talking about a 63-year-old and a 69-year-old in Cilia Flores. As we wait the video we think we're going to get here of Maduro, I want to go back to Lilia Luciano on the Colombia-Venezuelan border because she's got some reporting on what could happen next in Venezuela. The interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, Lilia, if you can hear me, who is she? And then you've got Maria Machado, the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner, opposition leader. What are her prospects for taking power back?
I'm so glad that you're asking that question, Tony. There is a kind of split screen happening in the minds of Venezuelans, both in Venezuela and outside right now. And people who I've talked to who are here in Colombia waiting to go back say, okay, without Maduro, the logical question would be that the election that happened in 2024 the person who won that election would rise to power. That's not Maria Corina Machado, and stay with me. The reason it's because the Maduro regime banned her from running. But her candidate, according to people in exile, according to people against the regime, should be the person who the U.S. should be propping up. The person who is the leader of the opposition is Maria Corina Machado. Instead, the Trump administration is negotiating at this moment with a person who was the number 2 to Maduro, the VP. Right now, what we know about Delcy Rodriguez is that she's telling people in Venezuela that the proper president is Maduro. She had to assume the role of the president because of what happened over the weekend, but she was his vice president. She has been an important figure of the regime for a long time. She has been Minister of Oil. She has been Minister of the Exterior. She has held important positions in the assembly. She comes from a family. I mean, her father was known worldwide for abducting an American back in the 70s. This is a person who has been part of Chavismo, of socialism, of what has run Venezuela over the last nearly 30 years. And now she's the one who's having conversations with the Trump administration. She is, by the measure of the regime, potentially consider it a little bit more moderate. She's used to negotiating on matters of sanctions, of oil. And so perhaps she's somebody that the Trump administration could trust to follow through to a certain degree, to perhaps abide by those conditions that they had offered Maduro, according to Secretary Rubio and to Trump, and that he continued to reject. But does she have the kind of support? Can she unify the extremely polarized country that is Venezuela? That is a very big question, and she's going to need a lot of powerful allies in there and out in the United States to avoid a crisis that we would feel immediately here, especially on the issue of migration.
Yeah, there is so much at stake. Lilia, behind you, we see the armored vehicles and the guards. Are we looking into Venezuela there, or is Venezuela in front of you?
Well, we are looking into Colombia. Venezuela is here to my left. There is the bridge where the cars are coming in. So the cars you're seeing behind me are coming from Venezuela. These armored vehicles are here because Colombia is foreseeing that there could be that migration crisis I mentioned. Every time that the regime has gripped to power, every time that the economy has gotten worse, every time that they have persecuted en masse, like what happened when what we saw during that last election, people leave Venezuela. They come to Colombia. But there's another reason why they're here, and this is something that the Minister of Defense explained to me. He said, look, if in fact the regime figures that are in power, specifically Delcy Rodriguez, follows what Trump is demanding, follows what the U.S. expects, that means that she's going to have to crack down on the illegal organized crime groups that are running drugs in Venezuela. If she does that, Colombia expects that they are going to start spilling over into Colombia. And Colombia's already existing problem of violence, of trafficking, of turf war is only going to get worse. So that's what these guys are truly preparing for here.
Yeah. Lilia, thank you very much. A lot to keep our eyes on, and we know you'll do it for us. I want to let our viewers know, once again, if you're just joining us, the ousted Venezuelan dictator Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores have just pleaded not guilty to drug and weapons charges in a New York City federal courthouse. It comes less than 72 hours after they were captured in a surprise U.S. military raid in Caracas, capturing them in their bedroom as they tried to make their way into a steel room. The judge on this Monday announced that the next court appearance after those not guilty pleas will come on March 17th at 11 a.m. A lot of time before then. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and tonight with me on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Tony Dokoupil in New York.